Colorado sells you the dream. Stunning mountain peaks, 300 days of sunshine, trails you've probably hiked yourself. But the brochure doesn't mention 8 people who vanished from those exact places: a luxury ski resort, a national park trail with a time-stamped entry and no exit, a highway corridor millions drive every year. And none of them have ever been found. Pull up a map of Colorado, because we're going to trace every one of these routes and show you exactly where the trail goes cold. We're going to start in a town most people in Colorado have never heard of. And after tonight, you won't forget it. Crestone, Colorado, sits in the San Luis Valley at the eastern base of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. And if you've never been there, it's almost impossible to convey what it feels like to arrive. The valley itself is enormous, flat, arid, ringed by mountains on every side. And Crestone is tucked against the foothills at an elevation of just under 8,000 feet. The nearest significant town is Alamosa, about 40 miles south. The nearest sheriff's office is in Moffett. And depending on road conditions and which part of the county you're calling from, a responding deputy could be 45 minutes to an hour away. The population of Crestone proper is somewhere around 150 people. There is almost no cell service in large parts of the surrounding area. The roads leading into and out of town are, in many places, unpaved. Crestone has been a destination for intentional spiritual communities since the 1970s, when large tracts of land in the area were donated for the establishment of retreat centers and ashrams. Today, the town is home to more than 24 spiritual organizations: Zen Buddhist, Hindu, Carmelite Catholic, Tibetan, eclectic. And it draws people from across the country who are searching for something quieter, something off the grid. It is, by design, removed from the rhythms of mainstream American life. That remoteness is the point. And in August of 2016, it is the thing that makes what happened to Crystal Ann Reisinger so difficult to unravel. Crystal was 25 years old when she came to Crestone. She had a daughter, a toddler, and according to people who knew her, she had come to the community seeking a different kind of life. She was present on social media up until around the time of her disappearance, and that digital record provides some of the clearest documentation of who she was in the weeks leading up to August 2016. Beyond that, many details about her life in Crestone come from community members, whose accounts, investigators would later note, were not entirely consistent with one another. That inconsistency would become central to everything that followed. Here's the first thing you need to understand about this case. The exact date Crystal Reisinger was last seen is disputed. That's not a minor detail. In a missing persons investigation, the confirmed last seen date is the spine of everything. It establishes where searchers look, what timeline they reconstruct, which witnesses are relevant. In Crystal's case, accounts from people in the Crestone community placed her last confirmed sighting at varying times across a multi-day window in August 2016. She was reportedly seen walking alone on a dirt road near town. After that, the accounts diverge. And by the time anyone formally reported her missing to Saguache County authorities, a significant amount of time had already passed. This is where it stops being a normal disappearance and becomes something harder to explain. Her daughter was left with community members. Her personal belongings, the status of her vehicle and other possessions, is uncertain based on public reporting. And this detail has been marked unknown in formal documentation, remained in the area. There is no confirmed evidence that Crystal left Crestone voluntarily. There is also no confirmed evidence of what happened to her. She simply did not return to pick up her daughter one day, and the people around her in a community that operates largely outside the standard structures of American civic life, did not immediately call the county. When the Saguache County Sheriff's Office did begin investigating, they faced a set of conditions that would have been challenging even if the report had come in immediately. The terrain surrounding Crestone is extensive and varied. Desert scrubland, creek drainages, steep foothills, wilderness areas. The Sangre de Cristo wilderness begins almost at the edge of town. Search resources in a rural Colorado county of fewer than 8,000 total residents are limited by definition, and the multi-day gap before the official report meant that whatever physical evidence might have existed along Crystal's last known route had been exposed to weather, foot traffic, and time. The search, by all public accounts, found nothing, no confirmed physical trace of Crystal Reisinger was located in the terrain around Crestone. But here's what doesn't make sense. And this is the detail that investigators and Crystal's family have continued to push on. The community in Crestone is small. Everyone knows everyone in the way that only truly small places allow. The number of people who could have been present during the window of Crystal's disappearance is not large. And yet, the witness accounts of what happened, when she was last seen, and what her state was like in the days before she vanished were, according to public reporting on the case, inconsistent enough to frustrate investigators trying to reconstruct a clear picture. Persons of interest were named in public reporting on this case, though no criminal charges had been filed as of the most recent publicly available information. That status, persons of interest, no charges, is one of the liminal spaces that missing persons cases often inhabit for years. It is not an exoneration, and it is not an accusation. It is simply where the investigation sits. The theories that exist around Crystal's disappearance are exactly what you'd expect from a case with this profile. One possibility is that she encountered some form of accident in the surrounding wilderness. A fall, a medical event, something that left her body in terrain that searches have not covered. Given the scope of the wilderness adjacent to Crestone, that possibility cannot be ruled out. Another possibility, labeled clearly as theory in public discussions of the case, is that she was the victim of foul play by a person or persons unknown. A third possibility, the one that investigators and family members have largely rejected, but that exists in the public record, is that she left voluntarily. Those who knew her have consistently pushed back against that framing. Her case was entered into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. As of public records available, it remains open. Her daughter would have been too young to remember her. That's the last confirmed thing we know about Crystal Ann Reisinger. She was a young woman, 25 years old, who came to a small mountain town in search of something better. And one day in August 2016, she walked down a dirt road and did not come back. The community she was part of has mostly moved on. The sheriff's case file has not. And somewhere in the San Luis Valley or in the Sangre de Cristos above it, the answer to what happened to her is still waiting. Crestone is isolated by design. The next case happened somewhere with 30,000 visitors a week. A ski resort with security cameras, a main street bright with bar lights at 2 a.m, hundreds of witnesses who were all awake and present. And somehow, in all of that light and noise and foot traffic, it was worse. The town of Vail, Colorado, does not feel like a place where people disappear. That's exactly the point. Vail is not a remote mountain outpost. It is a designed resort community, purpose-built, meticulously maintained, and during ski season, one of the most densely populated strips of real estate in the entire Rocky Mountain region. The main village sits in a narrow valley carved by Gore Creek, and almost everything in it is within walking distance of everything else. The hotels are clustered close to the slopes. The bars and restaurants line the pedestrian streets. The lighting is good. There are cameras. There are people everywhere, at all hours, because that is what a resort town at peak season looks like. It is, on paper, one of the safest environments imaginable for a young woman to spend a night out. On March 18, 2001, Claudia Kirchhoff walked out of a bar on Bridge Street in Vail at approximately 2 in the morning and was never seen again. Claudia was 24 years old. She was an attorney based in New York, sharp and physically fit, an experienced traveler who had been to Vail before. She was not someone unfamiliar with cold climates or mountain environments. She had come to Vail for spring break with a group of friends, the kind of trip that thousands of young professionals make to Colorado ski resorts every March. The kind of trip that is supposed to be a story you tell at parties for years afterward. Claudia was staying at one of the resort hotels. Her room was intact when investigators eventually checked it. Her passport was there. Her belongings were there. The key to her room was last used the night she disappeared. Here's how the first hours of this case unfolded and why the timeline matters. Claudia and her friends spent the evening of March 17th into the early hours of March 18th at bars in Vail Village. At some point in the night, the group became separated. A thing that happens in crowded resort towns with multiple venues and overlapping social groups. When Claudia did not return to the hotel, her friends, according to public reporting on the case, initially assumed she had found other company, met other people, ended up somewhere else for the night. This is not an unreasonable assumption in a resort environment. It is also the assumption that cost investigators critical hours. The report to Eagle County authorities did not come until approximately 24 hours after Claudia was last seen. By that point, whatever trail existed, physical, digital, witness-based, had already been significantly degraded by time and the constant foot traffic of a resort at peak season. Security camera footage from that period of Vail's infrastructure was limited, and what was reviewed did not produce a confirmed sighting of Claudia after she left the bar. And that's the last confirmed time anyone saw her, on Bridge Street, in the light and noise of Vail Village, at approximately 2 in the morning, walking alone. Now this is where the case turns dark. Because Vail is, geographically, a contained environment. The valley is narrow. The main access points are limited. Interstate 70 runs through it. But the village itself is a defined space. There are only so many directions a person on foot can go at 2 in the morning in early spring. Investigators and search teams covered the immediate area. They checked the creek. Gore Creek runs directly through Vail Village. It is not a wild, remote waterway, but a cold, fast mountain stream that is accessible from multiple points in the village, including areas near the bar district. The creek was searched. The surrounding terrain was searched. Canine units were brought in. Nothing was found. This is the contradiction that has defined the Claudia Kirchhoff case for more than 2 decades. She was a capable, experienced young woman in a well-lit, heavily trafficked area with limited geographic escape routes. The window between her last confirmed sighting and the first search was roughly 24 hours. Long, but not so long that physical evidence in a contained valley should have vanished entirely. The Eagle County Sheriff's Office investigated. The case received significant media attention, particularly in New York, where Claudia was from. Tips came in. Persons of interest were looked at. But here's what doesn't make sense. In a valley that narrow, with that many people, with cameras and witnesses, and a search that was eventually quite extensive, There was no confirmed physical trace, no item of clothing, no confirmed witness who saw her after Bridge Street, no forensic evidence pointing in any direction. The theories attached to this case are the ones you'd expect, and they remain exactly that, theories. The creek is the most discussed possibility, that Claudia, alone and in the cold of a March mountain night, encountered some kind of accident near the water. Gore Creek in March is running fast with snowmelt. The banks, while accessible, are uneven and dark away from the main lighting of the village. If something happened there, the creek drains downstream through a valley that has been built up significantly in the decades since, which means that the downstream search corridor, if relevant, is complicated by development and time. This remains officially unconfirmed. Foul play by an unknown party is also listed in public discussions of the case as a possibility that was investigated and never resolved. No one was ever charged in connection with Claudia's disappearance. No one was ever publicly named as a suspect. Her case has been periodically revisited. In the years since 2001, cold case investigators and journalists have returned to it more than once, because it has the qualities that make a case persistently disturbing. A specific place, a specific time, a specific last moment, and then a wall. The wall is the part that doesn't make sense. 24 years later, Eagle County records still list the case as open. Claudia Kirschhoek's family has never had an answer. The hotel key she was issued when she checked in was programmed to deactivate at checkout. It never needed to be deactivated. It was never used again after the night she disappeared. Vale at least had witnesses. It had cameras and a cordon of geography and thousands of people awake at the same hour. The next case had a trailhead, a registration log, a timestamp of a person entering, and then, in the language of search and rescue, a scent trail that simply stopped. No exit, no explanation, just a name on a sign-in sheet, a mountain, and silence. Rocky Mountain National Park receives somewhere between 4 and 5 million visitors per year, making it one of the most heavily trafficked national parks in the United States. It has paved roads, visitor centers, a well-maintained trail network, and a search and rescue infrastructure that is among the most developed of any park in the country. When someone goes missing in RMNP, the response is not slow. The resources are not small. The Park Service knows its terrain, its hazards, its seasonal patterns. And still, people vanish in Rocky Mountain National Park in ways that the searches and the resources and the institutional knowledge cannot fully account for. Monte Bileski's case is one of those. It comes from September 1999, in the area of the park near Long's Peak, the 14er that dominates the southern section of RMNP and draws experienced hikers from across the country every season. Long's Peak is not a casual trail. The summit route, the keyhole route, gains roughly 5,000 feet of elevation and requires an early start to avoid afternoon lightning. It is, by any measure, a serious mountain. But the trail system in the Long's Peak area also includes approaches and routes at lower elevation. In the backcountry zones that spread out through the park's forested and subalpine terrain. The specific details of Monte Bileski's background, his age, his hometown, the precise route he intended, are not fully established in the public record available for this case, and where that information is uncertain, it will be treated as such. What the public record does establish is this: he was an experienced hiker. He had registered with the park, which means there was a documented record of his presence and his intended route. He did not check out. When the overdue notification was triggered, when it became clear that he had not returned within his planned window, the Park Service initiated a search. This is standard protocol, and RMNP's search and rescue teams are trained specifically for the terrain they work in. The Longs Peak area was searched. The known trail was covered. Adjacent terrain was covered. Here's the critical detail. By accounts in the public record of this case, search teams working the area reported that a scent trail, the track that trained dogs follow based on physical trace, ended abruptly at a ridgeline, not at a cliff edge, not at a water crossing, not at any obvious terrain feature that would explain a sudden end to a trail, at a ridge, in open terrain. The scent simply stopped in a location with no logical explanation for where a person on foot could have gone from that point without leaving a continuing trace. This is the kind of detail that search and rescue personnel find deeply unsettling, because a scent trail ending abruptly in open terrain is not a normal outcome. It does not match the expected behavior of a person who has become lost or injured, or who has made a wrong turn. It matches almost nothing that has a clean explanation. The search continued. The park's resources were deployed over multiple days, as they are in a case of a registered hiker who fails to return from a route. But Monte Bileski was not found. Not on the trail, not in the adjacent terrain, not in the drainages and boulder fields and tree zones below the ridgeline where the scent ended. The search was eventually suspended without a confirmed discovery. His name remains in the park's registration log. There is no corresponding exit entry. There is a particular kind of dread that comes with a trail that has an entrance and no exit. Not a dead end. Those are explainable. Not a turnaround. Those leave footprints going both directions. An entrance with no exit means a person walked in, and according to every search conducted after the fact, did not walk out. The registration log at the Longs Peak trailhead is a physical document. Monte Bileski's name is in it. The date is in it. The intended route is in it. What is not in it, what was never added, because he never came back down to add it, is a departure time. Search and rescue teams in Rocky Mountain National Park deal with a wide spectrum of outcomes. Hikers who get lost and are found within hours. Hikers who fall and are located after a multi-day search. Hikers who make dangerous decisions above tree line and whose outcomes, while tragic, are explicable by the terrain and the weather and the physics of altitude. Monte Bileski's case does not fit cleanly into any of those categories. The weather on the relevant days in September 1999 was not, according to the framework of the blueprint, an obvious contributing factor. The trail was one he was prepared for. The experience level he brought to that registration log was not the experience level of someone making a first-time mistake on a 14er. And the scent trail ending at the ridge, that detail does not go away when you look at this case. Search dog handlers will tell you that scent trails can be disrupted by wind, by water, by certain terrain features. Ridge lines, where air currents converge and diverge unpredictably, are known to challenge scent work. That is a real, documented phenomenon in search and rescue literature, and it is the most straightforward explanation for what the dogs encountered on that ridge above Longs Peak. But here's what doesn't make sense. Even accounting for scent disruption at the ridge, the subsequent ground search of the terrain beyond that point, the boulder fields, the drainage channels, the tree line below, did not produce Monte Bileski. Not immediately. Not in the weeks and months that followed. A person who passed through that ridge, on foot, in any direction, should have been findable. The mountain, in all of its searched extent, gave nothing back. The theory space for this case is limited by the sourcing. A fall into terrain not covered by the primary search is possible. The Longs Peak area contains off-trail zones that are technically within the park, but outside the standard search corridors. particularly in the steep rock systems on the mountain's eastern and northern faces. A medical event, sudden and incapacitating, somewhere on the upper route is possible. Beyond that, the public record does not support confident theorizing, and this case will not be pushed further than the evidence allows. What it does allow is this image: a trail register, a name, a date, an intended route written in the hand of a man who knew what he was doing. And below it, in the column where returning hikers write their exit time, nothing. Just blank space, and a mountain that has not offered an explanation in 25 years. We are going to move now from the mountains to the city. From a trail with a timestamp to a highway, a phone signal, and a 19-year-old who was heading to work and never arrived. Colorado Springs is Colorado's second-largest city, sitting at the base of Pikes Peak on the Front Range, the eastern edge of the Rockies, where the mountains meet the Great Plains in a dramatic and abrupt transition. It is a city of about 500,000 people, with a strong military presence from Fort Carson and the Air Force Academy, a busy interstate corridor, and the kind of sprawling suburban geography that makes it feel simultaneously large and oddly disconnected. It is not remote. It is not isolated. It is a functioning American city with traffic cameras and cell towers and the full infrastructure of modern connectivity. On October 9th, 2012, Cara Nichols left her home in Colorado Springs. She was 19 years old. Cara had been working as a model, and by the accounts available in public reporting, she was heading to a modeling-related appointment on that day in October. She left her residence and got into her vehicle. The last communication documented from her phone occurred around the time she was leaving. And then, as her phone's signal was tracked by investigators reconstructing the timeline, something happened. The signal moved south, away from Colorado Springs, along the Height-25 corridor toward Pueblo. Pueblo is approximately 40 miles south of Colorado Springs, connected by one of the most traveled stretches of interstate in the state. At some point along that corridor, the signal stopped. Here's the critical detail that separates this case from a straightforward missing persons report. Cara's vehicle was eventually located in Pueblo. The car was found. Cara was not in it, and Cara was not found near it. The distance between where her phone last showed movement and where the car was eventually located is a gap that investigators have spent years trying to account for. A vehicle found without its driver in a city 40 miles from where the driver started. That is not an accident of geography. That is a data point that points somewhere specific, and the direction it points is difficult to look at directly. The investigation into Cara Nichols' disappearance was handled by the El Paso County Sheriff's Office, and it became, over time, one of the more extensively documented missing persons cases in the Colorado Front Range. The reason for that documentation is partly the timeline. The phone data, the vehicle recovery, the distance, and partly the profile of persons of interest that emerged in the years following her disappearance. According to public reporting, investigators identified individuals they considered relevant to the case. As of the most recent publicly available information, no criminal charges had been filed in connection with her disappearance. The persons of interest named in public reporting have not been convicted of anything related to this case. That status, persons of interest, no charges, no confirmed resolution, is where Cara's case has lived for more than a decade. Now this is where the case turns dark in a specific and quantifiable way. The I-25 corridor between Colorado Springs and Pueblo is not a wilderness. It is an interstate highway. There are businesses along it, gas stations, rest stops, communities visible from the road. The idea that a 19-year-old in her vehicle could travel that corridor that the vehicle could end up in Pueblo, and that no confirmed witness account could close the gap in what happened. That is the kind of thing that becomes a persistent ache in a case file. The highway sees millions of vehicles a year. It is surveilled, trafficked, populated. And still, the critical window of what happened to Kara Nichols along that stretch of road remains officially unknown. Her family has been publicly vocal about the case over the years, pushing for continued investigative attention. Her entry in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System remains active. She was 19 years old, and she had her whole life mapped out in front of her. And somewhere between Colorado Springs and Pueblo, that map was taken away from her. The last confirmed signal from her phone traced a line south on I-25. And then the line stopped. And what comes after the line stopping is the part of this case that no one has been able to write yet. From the Front Range, we go northwest, into the mountains, away from the interstate corridors, into a different kind of Colorado geography. The resort towns tucked in river valleys, the places that fill up in ski season and empty out in the shoulder months, the communities where the permanent population is small enough that a stranger stands out and a local's absence gets noticed. Steamboat Springs is that kind of place. Steamboat Springs sits in the Yampa Valley in Routt County in the northwestern part of the state. It is best known for its ski area, Steamboat Resort, and for a skiing tradition that is genuinely deep. The town has produced more Winter Olympians per capita than almost anywhere else in the United States. In the resort season, it is busy and lit up and full of visitors. Outside of peak season, it contracts back into itself. The permanent population is around 13,000 people. Everyone, as the saying goes, knows everyone. Stephanie Donahue disappeared from Steamboat Springs in 2007. The specific details of her case, the exact date, the precise circumstances of her last confirmed sighting, the specific location where she was last seen, are not fully established in the available public record, and where that information is uncertain, it will be treated as uncertain here. What the public record does establish is the framework. She was a young woman. She was last seen at a local establishment in town. And after that last sighting, there is no confirmed account of where she went. The search that followed is documented. Routt County authorities and volunteer searchers covered terrain in and around Steamboat Springs without locating her. The surrounding landscape includes the Yampa River, which runs through the valley, and the extensive forested hillsides above town that transition into the Routt National Forest. Both present the kind of terrain that can swallow a search without returning what it finds. But here's what doesn't make sense about a case like this one. In a town like Steamboat Springs, in a permanent community of 13,000 people, in a place where the local social network is genuinely tight, the post-disappearance silence is strange. Someone in that barn knew her. Someone on that street knew her route home. The kind of total evaporation that this case represents. Last seen at a local place, no confirmed witnesses after that, is harder to explain in a small mountain town than it would be in a city of 1 million. Small towns are, in theory, the places where disappearances get noticed faster and where the community network closes gaps more quickly. In Stephanie Donahue's case, the gaps were not closed. The theory space for this case is limited by the sourcing available. The Yampa River, the forest terrain, the highway corridors into and out of the valley, all represent possible explanations for what happened. Beyond that, the public record does not support confident theorizing, and the details that would allow for a fuller reconstruction have not been made consistently available. Her case remains open. A quiet main street in Steamboat Springs in the off-season is a particular kind of still. The buildings are the same buildings. The bar, where she was last seen, is still there, or its successor is. The valley sits between its ridgelines the same way it always has. And somewhere in that familiarity, in a place where everyone was supposed to know everyone, something happened that nobody, officially, can account for. There is something specific about the way a small mountain town closes around a disappearance. The community tightens. The same names come up in the same conversations. The search parties form and go out and come back. And after enough of that, after enough searches that return without answers, a kind of institutional exhaustion sets in. The case doesn't close. The family doesn't stop. But the town begins, gradually, to absorb the absence the way a tree absorbs a scar, growing around it, incorporating it, until it becomes part of the landscape rather than a wound in it. Stephanie Donahue's case has that quality. A name that Steamboat Springs carries without resolution. A file that Root County keeps without closure. And the Yampa Valley, which has no comment on any of it, which sits between its ridgelines exactly as it always has, indifferent to the question of what happened on one particular night in 2007. We are going to move now to a case that operates on a different kind of terrain. Not the isolated valley or the resort corridor, but the urban edge. The place where a city bleeds into foothills, where the trail system begins 3 blocks from a subdivision, where the mountain is simultaneously a backyard amenity and a genuine wilderness. Colorado Springs has that geography in abundance. The Pikes Peak region gives the city its identity. The mountain is visible from almost everywhere in the city, a constant presence on the western horizon. But the trail systems that climb into that landscape are real backcountry, with real consequences for the people who use them. Trevor Boss disappeared in 2013 in the Colorado Springs area, in the interface zone between the city and the Pikes Peak foothills. He was a young man, and the circumstances of his disappearance involved the trail systems in that region. The specific details of his route, his intended destination, and his last confirmed location are drawn from the available public record, and where those details are uncertain, they will be treated as such. What the public record establishes is this: Trevor failed to return from an outing in the foothills area. The search that followed was conducted in the trail systems and terrain adjacent to the Colorado Springs urban edge. Terrain that is, in places, deceptively rugged despite its proximity to the city. The Pikes Peak region contains steep drainages, dense scrub oak, and elevation changes that can shift the character of a hike from casual to serious within a relatively short distance. The trail systems are heavily used by the city's population, particularly on weekends, but they branch into less traveled corridors as they climb away from the trailheads. Here's the critical detail about this case's geography. The proximity to Colorado Springs is, counterintuitively, both a resource and a complication for a search. On one hand, it means that response times are faster, that more volunteers can be mobilized, that the infrastructure for a search operation is immediately available. On the other hand, it means that the terrain has been extensively modified at its lower elevations. Trails cross private property, drainage channels run under roads. The interface between natural and developed land creates ambiguities in search jurisdiction and coverage. A person who moves off-trail in that environment can enter spaces that are genuinely difficult to search comprehensively, even when the searchers are close to a city of 500,000 people. Trevor's search was conducted over an extended period. The terrain in the relevant area was covered. And then, as happens in the cases that populate this list, the search was suspended without a confirmed discovery. His case remained open for a significant period, with no definitive resolution available in the public record as of this account. This is the contradiction that the Pikes Peak foothills cases share. The mountain is right there. You can see it from downtown. The trails are mapped, marked, and walked by thousands of people every week. And somehow, in that visibility and accessibility, a person can vanish in a way that the subsequent search cannot fully account for. The mountain doesn't hide things through remoteness alone. It hides them through terrain, through the specific geometry of ravines and boulder fields and drainage channels that don't appear on the trail map, that don't show up in the overview, but that represent genuine voids in search coverage even when the searchers are good and the resources are present. Trevor Boss went into that landscape and did not come back out in the way anyone expected. His case is a reminder that the urban wildland interface is not a buffer zone between danger and safety. It is its own kind of terrain, with its own capacity for outcomes that don't resolve cleanly. Now this is where the case turns dark in a broader sense. Because Colorado Springs, across a 2-year window in the early 2000s, produced 2 cases with this profile. A young person, a trail or corridor, a last confirmed point, and then nothing. The second of those cases, Cara Nichols. We've already traced along the Rising 25 corridor south to Pueblo. The fact that the same city, in the same short window, generated 2 disappearances that both ended in open case files is the kind of coincidence that investigators note and do not publicly theorize about. It is simply a fact about Colorado Springs in that period. 2 people, 2 different routes, 2 open files. We're going to move now from the Front Range to the opposite corner of Colorado, southwest, into terrain that is genuinely, completely different from anything we've covered so far. The San Juan Mountains occupy the southwestern quadrant of the state, and they are, by most measures, the most extreme landscape in Colorado. The peaks here are higher, the roads are more remote, the infrastructure is thinner. This is mining country. Or it was, for a century of Colorado history. And the legacy of that mining era is written into the landscape in the form of old roads, collapsed tunnels, open shafts, and terrain that has been cut and blasted and carved in ways that create hazards that are not always marked and not always visible. Ouray County sits in the heart of this landscape. The town of Ouray itself is sometimes called the Switzerland of America, which is the kind of name that a place earns by being genuinely dramatic in its geography. It sits in a box canyon, surrounded on 3 sides by peaks that rise thousands of feet above the valley floor, accessible by highway passes that close in winter and challenge drivers in summer. The surrounding county is the kind of place where cell service is a suggestion, where the nearest trauma center is more than an hour away, and where a person who gets into serious trouble in the backcountry is, in practical terms, a long way from help. Austin Rollins disappeared in Ouray County in 2014. He was young, and by the accounts in public reporting, he was familiar with Colorado terrain. The kind of familiarity that comes from growing up in a state where the mountains are a constant presence, where people learn from childhood to read elevation and weather and road conditions. That familiarity matters as context, because it means the explanation of inexperience does not apply cleanly here. This was not someone making a first-time mistake in unfamiliar terrain. The sequence of events in Austin's case, as established by the public record, centers on a vehicle. His truck was found in a remote location in Ouray County, in terrain where the roads are, in many places, the old mining and jeep tracks that service the high country of the San Juans, narrow and unpaved and running through landscape that drops away sharply on both sides. The vehicle was found. Austin was not in it. There was no confirmed explanation for where he had gone from the point where the truck was parked. Here's what doesn't make sense about this case on the most basic logistical level. The location where the vehicle was found, in the remote terrain of Ouray County, is not a place where a person parks and then has obvious options for where to go next. The roads into that kind of terrain don't connect to walking routes with logical destinations. A person who leaves their vehicle in that landscape and heads out on foot is heading into the San Juans proper, into country that is, at the relevant elevations and in the relevant season, genuinely serious wilderness. The distance to the nearest town, the nearest habitation, the nearest anything, is not a distance that a person covers casually on foot. The search that followed Austin's disappearance was conducted across extensive terrain in Ouray County. Search and rescue resources from the county and the surrounding region were deployed. The mining-era infrastructure of the San Juans, the shafts, the adits, the collapsed tunnels that honeycomb the rock in that part of Colorado, represents a particular search challenge, because it creates void spaces that ground searches cannot fully penetrate and that aerial searches cannot see into. An open mine shaft in the San Juan Mountains is not always marked. It is not always visible from the surface. It is the kind of hazard that exists in the landscape, the way the landscape itself exists. Simply there, part of the geology of a century of extraction. Austin Rawlins' search found no trace of him. The case remained open. His truck sits in the timeline of this case like a question that the case cannot answer. Keys in the ignition. That detail is reported in the public record, though its precise significance is disputed. Parked at a point where the road meets the mountain, and the mountain offers no explanation for what comes next. At 10,000 feet in the San Juans, with the drop-offs and the mine shafts and the distance to anything human, the truck is the last concrete fact in the case. After the truck, there is only terrain. The San Juan Mountains have been producing outcomes like this for as long as people have been going into them. The mining era took men in large numbers and returned them in smaller numbers, and the backcountry era has continued in that tradition. Austin Rawlins is one of the most recent names on a very long list of people whom that landscape received and did not give back. But the next case on this list is the one that reframes everything that has come before it, because it is the oldest case we are going to look at, and it happened in a park that now receives 5 million visitors a year, and it involves a child who disappeared in front of his family in minutes, and it has never, in nearly 90 years, produced a single confirmed explanation. We are going back to Rocky Mountain National Park, and the year is 1938. July 1938. Rocky Mountain National Park is not yet the heavily managed, infrastructure-rich park it will become by the end of the 20th century. There are no visitor centers in the modern sense, no coordinated search and rescue teams with radios and helicopters, no GPS coordinates to plug into a rescue app. The park was established in 1915, and by 1938 it has been open to the public for 23 years. Long enough for families from Denver and Fort Collins and across the Front Range to consider it a reliable summer destination. A place where you bring a blanket and a picnic and let the children run in the meadows while the peaks rise above you in every direction. It is, in the summer of 1938, a place that feels safe, a place that feels knowable. The Beilhartz family came to Rocky Mountain National Park in July of that year for a camping trip. Alfred Beilhartz was 8 years old. He was, by the accounts that exist in the historical record of this case, a normal child on a normal family vacation. Present, visible, accounted for in the way that children on camping trips are accounted for, which is to say loosely, in the way that families have always managed children in outdoor spaces before the era of constant surveillance and digital tracking. He was near his parents. He was in a campground area adjacent to a creek and a trail system. He was, by any reasonable measure of the word, close. And then he was gone. The window in which Alfred Beilhartz vanished is measured in minutes, not hours, minutes. His parents were present. The campground was not a remote wilderness outpost. It was a developed camping area within the park, the kind of space that has fire rings and cleared tent pads, and the general infrastructure of a place designed to be used by families. The creek that ran adjacent to the campground was a mountain stream. Cold, fast in places, the kind of water feature that parents of young children watch carefully and consistently. Here's the critical detail that has defined the historical record of this case. The search that was initiated after Alfred's disappearance was not small, and it was not slow. For 1938, the response was, by the standards of the era, substantial. Park personnel, local volunteers, and family members searched the immediate area, the campground, the creek, the adjacent trail system, the surrounding terrain. They searched with the tools and methods available in 1938, which were primarily foot searches, and they searched extensively. They found nothing. No trace of Alfred Beilhartz was located in the terrain around the campground. Not in the creek, not in the brush, not in the trail corridors that extended from the camping area into the surrounding park. A child who was close enough to his parents that the disappearance was, measured in minutes, had, according to the search that followed, entered a space that the search could not account for. Now this is where the case turns dark in the specific way that children's disappearances always do. Which is to say, there is no framework that makes this comfortable. An 8-year-old in a campground adjacent to a creek, within sight distance of his family, disappearing in minutes. The explanations that present themselves are all terrible in their own way. The creek is the first thing any parent thinks of. A fast mountain stream, a child who slips, a current that moves quickly in July when the snowmelt is still feeding the water table. This is the most physically intuitive explanation, and it was the one that searchers prioritized. But the creek was searched. The downstream corridor was covered. Alfred Beilhartz was not found in the water, not found on the banks, not found in any of the locations that a creek-related accident would be expected to produce. The Vaffondeur, terrain beyond the campground, the forested hillsides, the brush zones, the rocky areas that climbed toward the higher elevations of that section of the park, was also covered. Nothing. The theory space for this case has been discussed in the decades since, and it will be labeled clearly here. An accident in the creek that carried him further downstream than the initial search corridor covered. Possible, and not ruled out by the evidence. An encounter with wildlife, which in RMNP in 1938 would have included black bear and mountain lion populations. Possible, though this type of incident typically produces some physical evidence, and no such evidence was reported. A fall into terrain not reached by the primary search. Possible in the rocky ground above the campground. And then there are the theories that the public record does not support with evidence, but that exist in discussions of this case. The possibility of human involvement, which was investigated at the time and produced no confirmed findings. None of these theories has ever been confirmed. None of them has ever been ruled out. Alfred Beilhartz was 8 years old, and he was in a campground in Rocky Mountain National Park. And in the time it takes to look away and look back, he was gone. 86 years have passed. The campground is still there. The creek is still there. The park receives 5 million visitors a year now, and the trails that were searched in 1938 have been walked billions of times since. by people who have no idea they are walking through the terrain of an unsolved disappearance. His family had photographs from that trip. The last photograph that Alfred appears in was taken that summer, in that park, before whatever happened happened. After that photograph, there is only the absence. The space in the frame where he would have been standing in every photograph that came after, if there had been photographs that came after. This is the point in the episode where it becomes necessary to step back from the individual cases and look at what the landscape itself is telling us. Because when you trace 8 disappearances across a single state, when you put Crestone and Vale and the Longs Peak Trail and the East 25 Corridor and Steamboat Springs and the Pikes Peak Foothills and Ouray County and Rocky Mountain National Park on the same map, a question emerges that is uncomfortable to sit with. Is this just Colorado? Is this just the natural consequence of a state that has extreme terrain, massive wilderness areas, millions of annual visitors, and a geography that creates genuine search challenges across almost every environment? Or is there something in the pattern itself? In the specific quality of the impossible gaps, the scent trails that end without explanation, the vehicles found without their drivers, the searches that cover the right terrain and come back empty? That deserves a harder look. David Paulides is a former law enforcement officer and researcher who has spent more than a decade documenting what he calls unusual disappearances in and around national parks across North America. His work, which he has published in a series of books and presented in documentary formats, is controversial. And that word is used here with precision, not as a dismissal. His methodology, his conclusions, and the theoretical framework he applies to the cases he documents are disputed by mainstream investigators and researchers. His work is not treated here as confirmed analysis, but the pattern he identified in Colorado's National Park Corridor, the cluster of cases with specific shared characteristics, cases that include Rocky Mountain National Park as a recurring location, is worth describing, because the characteristics he points to are, in many instances, simply the documented facts of the cases themselves. Scent trails that end abruptly, searches that cover the expected terrain without result, victims found when they are found in locations that were previously searched, the absence of physical evidence in areas where physical evidence should logically exist. The Alfred Beilhartz case is one that appears in this pattern literature. His disappearance has the characteristics that Paulides identifies as anomalous: proximity to water, young age, rapid disappearance from a supervised environment, extensive search with no result. Whether those characteristics indicate something genuinely anomalous or simply reflect the documented limitations of 1938-era search capabilities is a question that the evidence does not resolve cleanly. Here's what the evidence does resolve. Rocky Mountain National Park has produced multiple disappearances over its century of operation that have not been satisfactorily explained by the terrain, the weather, or the experience level of the people who vanished. Montebelleski in 1999, Alfred Beilhartz in 1938, others in the decades between and after, whose cases have not been included in this episode because the public record does not support a full reconstruction. The park is not unique in this. National parks across the American West have similar records. But RMNP's combination of extreme terrain, massive visitation, and the specific geography of its high-altitude zones creates a recurring pattern of cases that sit in the unsatisfying space between explainable and explained. The Park Service's official position on these cases is the one that the evidence supports. Missing persons in wilderness environments encounter terrain and weather hazards that can produce outcomes with no physical trace. This is true. It is documented. It is the most parsimonious explanation for most of the cases in question. It does not make the cases feel resolved. It does not make the blank exit column in the Longs Peak Trail register feel less like a void. It does not make the 1938 campground photograph feel like anything other than what it is: the last image of a child who was there and then wasn't. Before we move forward, it is worth pausing on something that the cases so far have in common. Something that is easy to miss when you are tracking individual timelines and specific locations. But that becomes visible when you step back and look at the whole map. Every single case we have covered has a moment. A specific, documentable, time-stamped moment where the person in question was last confirmed to be present in the world in a normal way. Crystal Reisinger walking down a dirt road in Crestone. Claudia Kirschhoek stepping away from a bar on Bridge Street at 2 a.m. Montebelleski's name written in a trail register at the Longs Peak trailhead. Kara Nichols's phone signal moving south along ER 25. Stephanie Donahue leaving a local establishment in Steamboat Springs. Trevor Boss heading into the Pikes Peak foothills. Austin Rollins' truck parked at the edge of high country terrain in Ouray County. Alfred Beilhartz present in a campground in Rocky Mountain National Park 1 minute and absent the next. Every case has that moment. And in every case, what follows the moment is a gap, a void where the next confirmed data point should be. That the investigations and the searches and the years of open case files have not been able to fill. The gap is the story. The gap is what makes these cases different from the ones that get solved, that get closed, that get filed away. The gap is what we are going to spend the rest of this episode looking at. Because understanding what produces that gap, what conditions, what terrain, what institutional failures, what simple bad luck, is the closest we can get to understanding what happened to 8 people across 80 years of Colorado history. We have 2 more individual cases to cover before we get to that analysis. We are going to start with a case that brings us back to Colorado Springs, back to the Front Range, back to the urban edge. And then we are going to travel to a geography we have not yet visited in this episode. One that will serve as the final individual case before we pull back to the wider view. The specific details of Trevor Boss's case require a more careful treatment than some of the others we have covered, because the public record for this case is thinner than for cases like Kara Nichols or Claudia Kirschhoek, and the timeline reconstruction available from public sources has significant gaps that must be acknowledged rather than papered over. What the public record establishes is this: Trevor Boss was a young man living in the Colorado Springs area in 2013. The circumstances of his disappearance involve the trail and foothills terrain west of the city, the Pikes Peak corridor that begins where the suburban grid ends and the mountain starts. He went into that landscape and did not return on the expected timeline. A search was conducted. The terrain in the relevant area was covered over a period of time that extended beyond the initial search window. His case has a specific quality that distinguishes it from the wilderness disappearances further north and west: the proximity to population. This is the paradox of the urban-wildland interface that Colorado Springs represents more completely than almost any other city in the state. The trail system that begins at the edge of the city's western suburbs climbs into genuine backcountry within a remarkably short horizontal distance. A person who enters that system and moves off the main trails, or who encounters a problem in the drainage channels and ravine systems that cut through the foothills, is simultaneously close to a city and genuinely far from help. Here's the critical detail about search operations in this kind of terrain. When a search is conducted in the Pikes Peak foothills, the search teams are working in a landscape that is constantly being used by the population of a city of 500,000 people: trail runners, mountain bikers, dog walkers, hikers. The traffic through that system is constant and heavy, Evidence degrades fast in high-traffic terrain. Scent trails are compromised by the passage of hundreds of other people and animals. The physical traces that a search team looks for in wilderness terrain are harder to read when the terrain is simultaneously a municipal recreational amenity. Trevor's search did not produce a resolution within the initial active search period. The case remained open. And then, and this is documented in the public record, though the specific timeline requires careful treatment, remains believed to be associated with Trevor Boss were eventually located in the area, sometime after his disappearance. The public record on the specific circumstances and location of that discovery is limited, and details beyond what is documented will not be added here. What the eventual discovery confirmed, to the extent that it confirmed anything, is that the landscape had held him in the specific way that the Pikes Peak foothills terrain is capable of holding things, in the ravines and the brush and the off-trail zones that the trail map does not show. Close enough to the city to seem findable and far enough from the main corridors to remain hidden through multiple search passes. This is the outcome that search and rescue professionals describe as the hardest kind. Not a vanishing with no resolution. Those carry their own particular weight, the weight of permanent uncertainty. But a resolution that comes too late, that answers the question of location without answering the questions that matter most to the people who loved the person. Trevor Boss was in the foothills west of Colorado Springs. He was close. The mountain kept him anyway. His family had answers of a kind. Not the answers that close a case completely in the human sense. The kind of closure that involves understanding, that involves a full account of what happened in the hours after the last confirmed sighting, just the answer to the question of where, just the location. The rest remains in the category of officially unknown. Now we go back to Crestone. Not to cover new ground on Crystal Reisinger's case, we have already spent time with her story, with the disputed timelines and the community dynamics and the multi-day gap before the official report. We go back to Crestone because there is something about the place itself that the earlier treatment of this case did not fully address. And that becomes important when you are trying to understand why this case has the specific shape it has. Crestone is not just remote in the geographic sense. It is remote in the institutional sense. The town exists, by design and by the philosophy of the communities within it, at some distance from the standard structures of American civic life. The sheriff's office is in Moffett, 45 minutes away. The nearest hospital is in Alamosa, which is 40 miles south. The culture of the community is one that, in many of its expressions, prioritizes internal resolution of problems over external institutional involvement. This is not a criticism. It is a documented characteristic of intentional communities of this type, and it is relevant to how Crystal's disappearance was handled in its earliest hours. The multi-day gap between Crystal's disappearance and the formal report to Saguache County is not simply a matter of people failing to act. It reflects, at least in part, the way the community around her processed what was happening. The informal consultations, the internal attempts to locate her, the gradual recognition that something had gone wrong in a way that required external involvement. By the time Saguache County had an official report, the window for the most time-sensitive investigative steps had already closed. Here's what doesn't make sense about the investigation that followed, taken on its own terms. Saguache County is a large county, nearly 3,000 square miles, with a small population and correspondingly limited law enforcement resources. A missing persons case in Crestone, at the base of the Sangre de Cristos, in terrain that extends from high desert scrubland to wilderness peaks, is a resource problem from the moment it is filed. The county does not have the search infrastructure that Eagle County has, or El Paso County, or the National Park Service. The response to Cristal's disappearance was constrained not by indifference, but by the simple arithmetic of a rural county with vast terrain and thin resources. And the persons of interest question, the public reporting that identified individuals whose accounts and histories drew investigative attention, sits over this case in a way that has never been resolved. Investigations that produce persons of interest and no charges exist in a particular liminal space. The absence of charges is not the same as the absence of evidence. It is the reflection of a threshold, the evidentiary standard for prosecution, that the available evidence may not have met, for reasons that are not always made public and that do not necessarily tell us what investigators believed happened. Crystal Reisinger's daughter is growing up in a world where her mother's face appears on missing persons websites and in true crime discussions and in the records of Saguache County. She was too young when her mother disappeared to carry any direct memory of her. The record that exists of Cristal, the social media posts, the accounts of people who knew her in Crestone, the investigative documents that are part of the public record, is the record of someone who was fully alive and present and searching for something in the summer of 2016. What she found, or what found her, is the question that the Saguache County case file has not answered. The San Luis Valley at night is one of the darkest places in Colorado. Crestone sits at the base of mountains that block the eastern sky, and the valley floor stretches west for miles without significant light pollution. On a clear night, the stars above the Sangre de Cristos are visible in a way that people who have grown up in cities find almost difficult to process. Too many, too bright, the Milky Way, a physical presence rather than an abstraction. It is a beautiful place. It is genuinely beautiful. And somewhere in that beauty, in that dark and that distance and that terrain, a 25-year-old woman walked down a road in August 2016 and did not come back. The valley held the question. It has not released the answer. We have been moving through this map of Colorado disappearances in a roughly chronological order. And we have been moving, in a sense, from the edges of explanation toward the center of something harder to name. The cases that have the most public documentation, Kara Nichols, Claudia Kirchhoff, sit at one end of the spectrum, cases where the timeline is relatively clear and the investigative record is relatively full, even if the resolution is absent. The cases with thinner public records, Stephanie Donahue, Monte Baleski, sit at the other end, cases where the gaps in what we know are almost as significant as the gaps in the cases themselves. What all of them share across that spectrum is the impossible gap. The moment after the last confirmed sighting where the expected next data point simply does not appear. The phone that stops pinging, the trail register with no exit entry, the hotel key that is never used again, the truck with the keys in the ignition at the edge of the mountain. These gaps are not poetic constructions. They are literal absences in the evidentiary record. Places where the documentation of a life stops, abruptly and without explanation, and does not resume. We are going to spend this part of the episode doing something different. We are going to look at the geography of these cases, not as individual locations, but as a system, a set of environments, with specific characteristics that recur across the 8 cases we have covered. And that may tell us something about why Colorado, specifically, produces missing persons cases with this particular profile. The first geographic category is what search and rescue professionals call transition zones. These are the spaces where one type of terrain becomes another, where a trail enters a drainage, where a road ends at a trailhead, where a resort village meets a creek, where a suburban street grid gives way to foothills brush. Transition zones are dangerous in ways that are not always intuitive. because they represent the point at which the familiar environment ends and the unfamiliar one begins. And that transition is not always marked, not always obvious, and not always reversible in the way that people expect. Vale is a transition zone case. The resort village, lit, populated, contained, meets Gore Creek, which is not lit, not populated in the way the village is, and not contained in the sense that it flows through and beyond the developed area into a valley that changes character within a short distance downstream. A person who moves from the bar district toward the creek at 2 in the morning is crossing a transition zone. The lighting changes, the footing changes, the relationship between where you are and where help is changes. Claudia Kirchhoff was an experienced traveler who knew cold climates and mountain environments. That experience does not necessarily prepare a person for a transition zone encounter at 2 in the morning in March. When the creek is running with snowmelt and the banks are ice-edged, and the gap between the familiar street and the unfamiliar water is measured in meters. The Pikes Peak foothills are a transition zone case. Trevor Boss entered a landscape where the city ends and the mountain begins. And in that transition zone, the rules that govern urban navigation, the street signs, the landmarks, the constant presence of other people, dissolve within a short horizontal distance. The trail system is mapped. The off-trail terrain is not. And in Colorado's foothills, the difference between the mapped trail and the unmapped drainage 50 feet to the side of it can be the difference between a recoverable situation and an unrecoverable one. Crestone is a transition zone case of a different kind, not terrain, but institutional. The town exists at the transition between the standard structures of American civic life and a set of community practices that operate outside those structures. The transition between those two systems, the point at which the community's internal processes gave way to the sheriff's external ones, consumed days that the investigation could not recover. The second geographic category is vertical terrain. Colorado's defining geographic characteristic is elevation, and elevation creates consequences that are easy to underestimate and difficult to escape. The San Juan Mountains, where Austin Rollins' truck was found, operate at elevations where the physics of human physiology change. Exertion is harder. Decision-making can be compromised by altitude effects that are subtle and often unrecognized. The distance that a person can cover on foot before they are in serious trouble is shorter at 10,000 feet than at sea level, and the terrain features that create hazards, the mine shafts, the cliff edges, the unstable scree slopes, are present in greater density in the high San Juans than almost anywhere else in the American West. Rocky Mountain National Park is vertical terrain. The cases from RMNP, Monte Bolesky in 1999, Alfred Beilhartz in 1938, involve elevations and terrain gradients that compress the margin for error to almost nothing. A person who moves off trail above 12,000 feet in RMNP is in a landscape where a single misstep can produce a fall that ends in terrain that ground searchers cannot safely access. The scent trail that ended at the ridge above Long's Peak is consistent with a scenario in which a person crossed into that kind of terrain. Not a dramatic cliff edge, but a gradual transition into steeper, more exposed ground, where the consequences of a fall become increasingly serious and the recovery of a person who falls becomes increasingly difficult. Alfred Beilhartz was 8 years old. The vertical terrain argument is more complicated for a child in a campground adjacent to a creek. But the creek itself is vertical terrain in a functional sense. Mountain streams at elevation run fast and cold in July, fed by snowmelt, and they carry things. The downstream corridor of a mountain stream is a search challenge because the water moves and the channel changes and the debris that accumulates in the bends and the log jams is not always accessible to searchers working the banks. The third geographic category is institutional distance. This is the gap between where a person disappears and where the resources capable of finding them are located. Not just physical distance, though that matters, and Saguache County's 45-minute response time to Crestone is a concrete example of how physical distance shapes investigative outcomes. But also jurisdictional distance, the space between different agencies' areas of responsibility, and temporal distance, the gap between when a disappearance occurs and when it is reported. Kara Nichols' case illustrates temporal distance. The last confirmed phone signal on I-25 south of Colorado Springs, the vehicle found in Pueblo. These data points are separated by both distance and time, and the investigation that tried to bridge them was working in a corridor that crosses two county jurisdictions, El Paso and Pueblo, with the complexity that multi-jurisdictional cases always carry. The gap between where she was last tracked and where her car was found is a corridor that millions of people drive every year, a corridor that was being driven by millions of people in the days and weeks after she disappeared, by which point the forensic value of that corridor had been thoroughly degraded by traffic and weather and time. Steamboat Springs illustrates institutional distance of a different kind. A small resort town in a rural county is not the same as Colorado Springs in terms of investigative resources. The Routt County Sheriff's Office is a professional agency, but it operates with the resource constraints of a rural county. And a missing persons case that does not produce early physical evidence in those conditions is a case that can go cold quickly. Not from lack of effort, but from lack of the specific resources. Forensic specialists, extended search teams, dedicated investigative hours that larger urban agencies can deploy. The fourth category is the one that is hardest to name without sounding like something other than a documentary analysis. It is the category of cases where the terrain and the timeline and the available evidence taken together do not produce a satisfying mechanical explanation. Where the documented facts of the search, the scent trail that ended at the ridge, the 8-year-old who vanished in minutes from a supervised campground, the truck with the keys in the ignition at the edge of the high country, sit at the edge of what the three previous categories can explain. These are not supernatural claims. They are not presented as such here. They are simply the cases where the accounting does not fully close, where the search covered the expected terrain and the terrain did not answer, where the time and the distance and the resources do not produce a result that the evidence supports. Those cases exist in every state that has wilderness. They exist in Colorado in particular density for reasons that the terrain and the institutional geography and the sheer volume of human movement through the landscape can partly but not fully account for. The pattern, literature that Paulides and others have developed around these cases is, at its most defensible, a documentation of that category. A collection of cases where the standard explanatory frameworks produce incomplete accounts. The conclusions drawn from that documentation are, as noted earlier, disputed. The documentation itself, the cases as documented facts, is harder to dispute. Here's the critical detail that emerges when you look at the 8 cases in this episode as a system rather than as individual stories. The impossible gap, the void between the last confirmed sighting and the next data point, appears in every single one of them. It appears in cases with good investigative resources and in cases with thin ones. It appears in urban environments and in genuine wilderness. It appears in 1938 and in 2016. It appears in cases where experienced adults made careful plans and in cases where a child was standing next to his family. The gap is not explained by terrain alone. It is not explained by institutional failure alone. It is not explained by the specific characteristics of any individual case. It is a recurring feature of the Colorado missing persons record that crosses every variable we have examined. And that is the thing that this map, with its 8 pins and its 8 open files, does not let you look away from. There is a document that exists in the records of every one of these cases. It is not a dramatic document. It does not contain confessions or forensic breakthroughs or the kind of definitive evidence that closes a case in a satisfying way. It is a form, a standard missing persons report form filed with whatever agency had jurisdiction, containing the basic identifying information of the person in question and the circumstances of their disappearance, as understood at the time of filing. Name, age, physical description, last known location, last confirmed contact, circumstances. These forms are, in most cases, the first official document produced by a disappearance. They are also, in the cases on this list, among the only official documents produced, because the investigations that followed the initial reports did not generate the subsequent documents that a resolved case produces. No arrest report, no charges filed, no coroner's report based on a confirmed identification in most of these cases. Just the initial form, and the updates that investigators added over the months and years that followed. And then, eventually, the status notation that every open file carries. Active. No new leads. We are going to spend this part of the episode with 2 of the cases that have received the least detailed treatment so far. Not because they are less important, but because the public record for each of them requires careful handling. And earlier parts of this episode were necessarily focused on cases where more documentation was available. What follows is a more complete reconstruction of Austin Rollins' disappearance in Ouray County and a return to the Montebelleski case in Rocky Mountain National Park, with attention to the specific investigative beats that the earlier treatment did not fully address. Austin Rollins, Ouray County, Colorado, 2014. To understand what happened, or rather, to understand why what happened has never been fully established, you need to understand Ouray County's terrain in the specific way that search and rescue personnel understand it. Not as a scenic backdrop, not as the Switzerland of America that the tourism literature describes, but as a 3-dimensional problem space with specific characteristics that make it one of the most challenging search environments in the American West. The San Juan Mountains are not simply high. They are complex in their vertical dimension in a way that distinguishes them from the Front Range peaks or even the Rockies north of Yearhouse 70. The geology of the San Juans is volcanic. These are mountains built by caldera events and lava flows, rather than by the tectonic uplift that shaped the Rockies proper. And that volcanic geology produces a landscape of sheer cliffs, unstable talus fields, and deeply incised canyon systems that cut hundreds of feet into the rock. The roads that access the high country in Ouray County are, in many cases, the original mining tracks from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Narrow, unguarded, running along cliff edges above drops that are measured in hundreds of feet. The mine infrastructure is the other dimension of this landscape that shapes search operations. The San Juan Mountains were one of the most intensively mined regions in North America during the silver and gold rush era, and the legacy of that mining is a landscape literally honeycombed with shafts, adits, tunnels, and collapsed workings. Many of these features are documented, many are not. The Colorado Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety maintains records of abandoned mine lands, but the database is not complete. There are workings in the San Juans that predate systematic documentation, that were dug by individual prospectors working claims that were never formally recorded, that exist in the rock as physical facts without any corresponding paper trail. A mine shaft in the San Juan Mountains can be invisible from 5 feet away. The collar, the opening at the surface, is often overgrown, sometimes partially collapsed, sometimes concealed by talus debris from above. The depth of these features varies from a few feet to several hundred feet. A person who steps into an undocumented shaft in the high country above Ouray does not necessarily produce a scent trail that search dogs can follow, because the shaft goes down rather than across the surface. Ground searchers walking within feet of an opening may not see it. Aerial searches cannot penetrate into subsurface features. This is the search context for Austin Rollins' disappearance. His truck was found in remote terrain in Ouray County, on or near one of the high country roads that access the San Juan backcountry above the town of Ouray, in landscape that has the characteristics described above. The vehicle's location, in terrain where roads of this type are typically accessed by 4-wheel drive vehicles, and where the surrounding environment transitions quickly from road to cliff edge to mine-scarred mountainside, is the last confirmed data point in his case. Here is what the search that followed was working against. The terrain in that area of Ouray County presents search teams with a 3-dimensional problem that surface searches alone cannot fully resolve. The horizontal search area, the ground that teams can cover on foot and by air, is extensive, running across ridges and through drainages and along the old mining roads that connect the high country features. Within that horizontal area, the vertical dimension of the mine shafts and the canyon systems creates a set of subsurface and sub-cliff face voids that are effectively inaccessible to the primary search tools. A ground team walking a grid across that terrain is covering the surface. It is not covering the shafts. Ouray County Search and Rescue is a well-regarded volunteer organization with experience in exactly this type of terrain. The search for Austin Rollins was not a small or poorly organized effort. It drew on the county's resources and, by public accounts, was conducted with the seriousness and expertise that a missing persons case in that terrain demands. The search found no trace of him. The specific details of what investigators concluded about the circumstances of Austin's disappearance, why he was in that location, what he was doing there, whether anyone else was known to be with him or in the area, are not fully established in the public record available for this account. And details not supported by that record will not be added here. What is established is the vehicle, the terrain, the search, and the outcome. 3 of those 4 elements are documented. The 4th, what happened, is not. The truck. That is the image that this case returns to, the detail that sits at the center of the impossible gap. A vehicle parked in high country terrain in Ouray County, in a location that suggests the driver intended to go somewhere on foot from that point. The mountain above it, the shafts within it, the distance to any human habitation that could serve as a destination, the search that covered the reachable terrain and came back without him. Austin Rollins was young. He knew Colorado terrain. He had the experience that should have made him a cautious decision-maker in a landscape like that one. And somewhere in the San Juans above Ouray, in terrain that the search covered as thoroughly as the terrain permitted, he is still, officially, missing. Monte Baleschi, Rocky Mountain National Park, September 1999. The Longs Peak area of RMNP in September is in transition. The summer climbing season is winding down. The 14er traffic that peaks in July and August has thinned as the school year begins, and the early autumn weather patterns start bringing less predictable conditions to the summit routes. September in RMNP still offers window days of extraordinary clarity. With the aspen beginning to turn in the lower elevations and the high ridges carrying the first traces of early frost at night. It is, by many measures, the best month to be in Rocky Mountain National Park if you are an experienced hiker who wants to avoid crowds and still access the high country. Monte Belleschi registered with the park, which means he understood the protocol, the system by which the Park Service tracks backcountry users and initiates searches when registrants fail to return on their stated schedule. That protocol is one of the most important safety mechanisms the park has, because it removes the delay that costs investigations in cases like Crystal Riesinger and Claudia Kirchhoff. The park knows you went in. The park knows when you were supposed to come out. When the window closes without your return, the response begins. The response in Monte Belleschi's case began on the appropriate timeline. The search that followed was conducted by personnel who know the Longs Peak area at a level of detail that no civilian hiker can match. Rangers and search and rescue specialists who have worked that terrain through multiple seasons, who know the drainage patterns and the boulder systems and the places where trails look continuous, but the footing becomes unstable, and the places where the mountain presents as accessible but acts as a trap. And the scent trail ended at the ridge. We have already spent time with this detail, but it deserves a second look in the context of what we now know about the broader landscape of Colorado disappearances. A scent trail ending at a ridge in the Longs Peak backcountry is a specific piece of evidence. It tells us where Monte Belleschi was. It tells us the direction he was moving. It does not tell us what happened when he reached that ridge, or what the ridge looked like in the specific light and weather conditions of that September afternoon, or what was on the other side of the ridge that might have drawn him forward or might have presented a hazard he did not anticipate. The terrain beyond that ridge, in the Longs Peak area, includes some of the most complex ground in the park. The eastern faces of the Longs Peak Massif are a system of cliffs and couloirs and boulder fields that represent genuine technical terrain. Not the maintained trail, not the keyhole route that recreational hikers use, but the raw mountain face with all of its geological complexity and all of its consequences for a person who enters it without technical equipment or without the specific knowledge of where that terrain goes. The search covered the accessible portions of that terrain. It did not find Monte Belleschi. The inaccessible portions, the cliff systems, the deep couloirs, the boulder accumulations that can bury a person under tons of rock, cannot be searched comprehensively by any team with any level of resources. The mountain has voids that are simply not reachable. His name in the trail register is a document of presence. The blank exit column is a document of absence. Between those two facts, presence and absence, entry and no exit, the mountain offers no explanation. Longs Peak rises to 14,259 feet, and it does not comment on the question of what happened to Monte Belleschi on its slopes in September 1999. It simply stands there, above the trail register, above the search records, above the open case file in the park's missing persons documentation, unchanged and unanswering. The park will open its gates tomorrow morning. 4 to 5 million people will pass through Rocky Mountain National Park this year. Most of them will hike the trails, take the photographs, drive the Trail Ridge Road, and return to their cars and their hotels and their lives without encountering anything that the park's extensive safety infrastructure cannot manage. The mountain is, for almost everyone who visits it, exactly what the brochure says it is. For a small number of people, across a century of the park's operation, it has been something else. Something that the registration log records the entry of and does not record the exit of. Something that the searches have covered and not resolved. Something that stands at 14,000 feet and does not answer. Let's talk about what searches find and what searches miss. Because this is the part of the conversation that most documentary treatments of missing persons cases skip over. The operational reality of what a search actually covers versus what it is assumed to cover. And the gap between those two things that explains, at least in part, why cases like the ones on this list remain open for years and decades without resolution. When a search is initiated for a missing person in Colorado's wilderness terrain, the operational model follows a framework developed by search and rescue professionals over decades of practice. The framework begins with a probability zone, an assessment based on the person's last known location, their stated route, their experience level, and the terrain type of where they are most likely to be found. Resources are deployed to cover the highest probability zones first. If those zones are searched without result, the probability model is updated and the search expands outward. This model is sound. It is based on accumulated data from thousands of search and rescue operations, and it reflects genuine statistical knowledge about where lost or injured people are typically found. The problem is the word typically. The cases on this list are not typical. By definition, by the very fact that they are still open, still unresolved, still listed as active in name use and county sheriff databases, they are the cases that fell outside the probability model. They are the cases where the person was not in the highest probability zone, or the second zone, or the zones beyond that. They are the cases where the model's predictions did not hold. And when the model's predictions don't hold, search teams face a choice that has no good answer. Expand the search indefinitely, consuming resources that are finite and personnel that are volunteer or seasonal, into terrain that becomes increasingly low probability with each expansion, or suspend the active search, maintain the case as open, and wait for new information, a tip, a discovery, a piece of evidence that reorients the probability model toward a location that was not previously considered. Most of the cases in this episode reached the second stage. The active search was suspended. The case remained open. New information, in most cases, did not come. There is a specific conversation that happens in search and rescue communities about the cases that don't resolve. The ones where the search covered the expected terrain, the model was applied correctly, the resources were deployed professionally, and the person still was not found. These conversations happen in training contexts and in after-action reviews, and in the informal discussions that search and rescue volunteers have with each other after a difficult operation. They are not public conversations, for the most part. But their content is documented in the search and rescue literature, and it is worth bringing into this analysis because it addresses directly the question of why Colorado's open cases have the specific profile they have. The first theme in those conversations is terrain complexity. Colorado's wilderness environments are not simple. They are vertically complex, geologically varied, seasonally dynamic, and in many areas heavily modified by a century of mining and logging activity that created subsurface voids, unstable slopes, and altered drainage patterns. A search that covers the terrain in the two-dimensional sense, the surface, the trails, the visible features, does not necessarily cover the terrain in the three-dimensional sense that the terrain actually occupies. This is the mine shaft problem in the San Juans. This is the cliff system problem in Rocky Mountain National Park. This is the creek drainage problem in Vail. The terrain has depth, and searches have limits. The second theme is time. Every hour that passes between a disappearance and the initiation of a search is an hour in which physical evidence degrades, in which scent trails are compromised by weather and traffic, in which the window for finding a person who is injured but alive closes incrementally. The cases in this episode span a range of reporting delays, From the Park Service protocol that gave Montebelleski's case an appropriate response window to the multi-day gap in Kristall, Riesinger's case that preceded the sheriff's involvement. Time is the variable that search teams cannot recover. They can expand search areas and deploy additional resources, but they cannot go back to the first hour and start there instead of the third day. The third theme is witness reliability. In the cases where the last confirmed sighting comes from a witness, Claudia Kirchhoff on Bridge Street, Crystal Riesinger on a road near Crestone, Stephanie Donahue leaving a local establishment in Steamboat Springs. The quality of the witness account shapes everything that follows. The exact location, the direction of travel, the person's apparent state, calm, distressed, intoxicated, hurried. A witness account that is imprecise about location or time creates a probability zone that may not contain the actual last position. A witness account that is delayed, given days after the fact, carries additional uncertainty. And a case like Crystal Riesinger's, where multiple witness accounts are not fully consistent with each other, creates a probability model that is, from the beginning, built on an uncertain foundation. The fourth theme in those conversations is the one that is hardest to discuss in a professional context, because it touches on the limits of the operational model itself. It is the theme of anomalous outcomes. Cases where the search covered the terrain correctly, the model was applied to the available evidence, and the result simply does not match what the terrain and the timeline should have produced. The scent trail that ended at the ridge in the Longs Peak backcountry is an anomalous outcome. A scent trail in terrain that has been searched comprehensively should not simply end. It should transition to water, to rock, to an air current disruption that the handlers can identify and account for. An abrupt end in open terrain, followed by a ground search of the area beyond that does not find the person, is not a standard outcome. It is the kind of outcome that search and rescue professionals note, document, and carry forward into their understanding of the cases that don't resolve. Alfred Beilhart's is an anomalous outcome. A child disappearing in minutes from a supervised campground in a developed area of Rocky Mountain National Park, with a creek and a trail system that were both searched extensively, should produce some kind of physical evidence within the immediate search area. The standard outcome for a child who enters a mountain creek is recovery. Tragic, but recovery. The standard outcome for a child who runs into adjacent brush is a relatively rapid location by searchers. Alfred Beilhart's produced neither standard outcome. In 1938, with the search tools available in 1938, the absence of a result can be partially attributed to the limitations of the era's search capabilities. But the extensive search that was conducted in that park in the days following his disappearance, by people who knew the terrain and were motivated by the urgency of a missing child, was not a small thing. It was the best effort available at the time, and it produced nothing. These anomalous outcomes are not evidence of anything supernatural. They are not presented as such here. They are the cases where the accounting does not close, where the sum of the terrain, the timeline, the search, and the evidence does not equal a satisfying resolution. They are the cases that search and rescue professionals carry with them, that investigators return to in quiet hours, that families live inside for the rest of their lives. There is a researcher named David Paulides, whose work on missing persons cases in and around national parks has generated significant public attention and significant professional controversy. We have mentioned his work in earlier parts of this episode, and we want to return to it here in a more complete way. Because the Colorado cases in this episode overlap substantially with the geographic clusters he has documented, and treating that overlap honestly requires more than a passing reference. Paulides' methodology involves identifying missing persons cases in national park environments that share a specific set of characteristics. The characteristics he points to include rapid disappearance from supervised or populated environments, scent trails that end abruptly, searches that cover expected terrain without result, victims found in locations previously searched, absence of expected physical evidence, and proximity to water as a recurring feature of vanishing points. He applies these criteria across a large data set of cases drawn primarily from NPS missing persons records and public law enforcement files. The cases he documents are, in most instances, real cases. The people are real. The disappearances are documented. His argument is that these cases, taken as a data set rather than as individual events, exhibit patterns that are statistically unusual, and that the standard explanatory frameworks, terrain, weather, experience level, probability of injury, do not fully account for. The response from mainstream search and rescue and law enforcement communities has been skeptical, for reasons that are documented in professional journals and in direct responses to his work. The skeptics argue that his methodology selects for unusual cases by design, and then identifies them as a pattern, which is a form of confirmation bias. They argue that the characteristics he identifies as anomalous are individually explicable by known factors: scent disruption by terrain features, search limitations in complex environments, the statistical reality that some cases simply do not produce physical evidence. They argue that his theoretical conclusions go significantly beyond what the documented facts support. Both of these things can be true simultaneously. Paulides' documented cases can be real, and his methodology can be flawed. The patterns he identifies can be genuine statistical features of the dataset, and the conclusions he draws from those patterns can be unsupported by the evidence. The cases themselves, the people, the disappearances, the open files, exist independently of his theoretical framework. They were documented before he wrote about them, and they will remain documented after the debate about his methodology has run its course. What the Colorado cases in this episode contribute to that debate is simply their presence: 8 cases across 8 decades, with the specific profile that has been described throughout this episode. The impossible gap. The search that covered the terrain and came back without the person. The open file. The family that is still waiting. The Paulides framework does not explain these cases. The mainstream framework does not fully explain them either. The cases sit between those two frameworks, documented and unresolved, waiting for an explanation that the evidence has not yet produced. There is one more piece of this analysis that needs to be addressed before we move toward the close of this episode. It is the question of what the families of the missing know, or believe they know, about what happened to the people they are looking for. Families of missing persons occupy a specific and terrible epistemological position. They have access to information that investigators do not always have. The knowledge of the person's habits, relationships, fears, intentions. The kind of intimate contextual knowledge that can distinguish between a voluntary disappearance and an involuntary one. That can identify the specific detail in an investigative report that doesn't match what the family knows about how their person behaved. And they are simultaneously excluded from large portions of the investigative record, kept outside the loop by protocols that exist for legitimate legal reasons, but that produce, from the family's perspective, a silence that is hard to distinguish from institutional indifference. Crystal Reisinger's family has been publicly vocal about their belief that her disappearance was not voluntary and not accidental. They have pushed for continued investigative attention, have maintained an active public presence on the case, and have not accepted the silence of the official record as a resolution. Kara Nichols' family has similarly maintained a public presence around her case, keeping her name and her image in the public record in a way that periodically generates renewed investigative attention and media coverage. These families are not passive recipients of institutional decisions. They are active participants in the ongoing effort to find answers that the official investigations have not produced. The families of Montebelleski and Alfred Beilhartz carry a different kind of weight. Not the weight of active advocacy against institutional silence, but the weight of time. The years that have passed since 1999 and 1938 have not produced new evidence, have not generated the tips or the discoveries that reopen cold cases. They have produced only the continued absence of the person and the continued presence of the open file. All of these families are waiting. For different things, across different timelines, with different relationships to the investigative record. But waiting, all of them, for the thing that the cases in this episode have not yet produced: an answer. There is a particular quality to the light in Colorado in the late afternoon, when the sun has dropped behind the Rockies and the sky above the eastern plains holds the last color of the day in long horizontal bands: amber, then rose, then the deep blue that precedes full dark. It is the kind of light that photographers chase and painters try to reproduce, and that people who have spent time in Colorado carry with them as a sensory memory long after they have left the state. It is the light that the tourism board means when it talks about 300 days of sunshine. It is genuinely beautiful. It is the kind of beauty that makes a place feel safe, feel knowable, feel like the kind of place where bad things do not happen because the light is too clean and the air is too clear and the mountains are too present and solid to allow for mystery. And yet, we have spent 9 parts of this episode tracing the roots and the timelines and the investigative records of 8 people who vanished in this light, in this landscape, across 80 years of Colorado history. We have been careful with the evidence. We have labeled the unknowns. We have not invented facts or fabricated proof or pushed the theories further than the documented record allows. And having done all of that, having traced every route as carefully as the public record permits, we arrive at the same place that the investigators arrived at, that the search teams arrived at, that the families have been living in for years and decades. The accounting does not close. This part of the episode is going to do something that the earlier parts have been building toward. We are going to look at the 8 cases as a complete set, not individually, not as a series of separate tragedies with separate geographies and separate timelines, but as a pattern. A pattern that Colorado's landscape and Colorado's institutional record has produced over the span of a human lifetime, and that deserves to be examined with the same rigor that we applied to the individual cases. The first thing that the pattern reveals is a geographic distribution that cuts across the simple categories. We said earlier in this episode that these cases span ski resorts, highway corridors, national park backcountry, high-altitude mining terrain, remote spiritual communities, and urban wildland interfaces. That is true. And at the surface level, it suggests that these cases have nothing in common except their state. That Colorado is simply a large and varied state with a large and varied missing persons record, and the cases happen to cluster within its borders the way any statistical distribution clusters within the borders it occupies. But look at the distribution more carefully. Every single case in this episode occurred within a specific geographic relationship to water. Claudia Kirschhoek disappeared within walking distance of Gore Creek. Alfred Beilhartz was last seen near a creek adjacent to his family's campground. Montebelleski was hiking in the Longs Peak area. where multiple drainages feed into the streams that run down the mountain's flanks. Crystal Riesinger disappeared in Crestone, which sits at the base of mountains that feed the Cottonwood Creek drainage and multiple other water systems. Kara Nichols' last confirmed phone signal followed I-25 South, a highway that parallels the Arkansas River drainage. Austin Rollins' truck was found in high country terrain above Ouray, a town built at the confluence of multiple mountain streams. Stephanie Donahue disappeared in Steamboat Springs, which is built along the Yampa River. Trevor Boss entered the Pikes Peak foothills, which are cut through by the drainage systems that feed Fountain Creek. This is not presented as a definitive finding. It is presented as a documented observation. Every case in this episode has a water feature in its geography. That observation is consistent with what Paulides has noted in his dataset, and it is also consistent with the straightforward reality that Colorado's landscape is defined by its drainage systems. The mountains create the water shapes the valleys, and the human settlements and trail systems are built along the water. In a state where every inhabited place and every trail system has a relationship to a creek or a river or a drainage, finding water in the geography of a disappearance may simply be a reflection of the landscape, rather than a meaningful pattern. Both interpretations are possible. The observation stands regardless of which interpretation you favor. The second thing the pattern reveals is a timing distribution that is less easily explained by landscape geography alone. Look at the months. Crystal Riesinger disappeared in August. Monte Baleski disappeared in September. Claudia Kirchhoff disappeared in March, early spring, when the snowmelt begins. Alfred Beilhartz disappeared in July. Austin Rollins disappeared in 2014. And the seasonal details are not fully established in the public record. But Ouray County's high country terrain is most accessible in the summer months. Trevor Boss disappeared in 2013, with seasonal details similarly limited in the public record. The cases cluster in the shoulder seasons and the summer, the periods when Colorado's terrain is at its most accessible, when the trails are open and the roads are passable and the parks are full and the resort towns are running at capacity. This is, again, consistent with a straightforward explanation. More people in the landscape means more opportunities for disappearances. The cases happen in the seasons when people are present because those are the seasons when people are present. But the clustering also means something else. It means these cases happened when the search conditions were, in most instances, at their best. Summer and early autumn in Colorado provide the longest daylight windows for search operations, the most accessible terrain, the most favorable weather for extended search periods. These were not cases that happened in the dead of winter, when short days and deep snow make searches operationally impossible. These were cases that happened when the mountains were as searchable as they ever get, and the searches still came back empty. The third thing the pattern reveals is an experience distribution that cuts against the easy explanation of novice error. Claudia Kirchhoff was an attorney who had traveled extensively and was familiar with cold mountain environments. Monte Baleski was an experienced hiker who had registered his route with the park. Austin Rollins was, by public accounts, familiar with Colorado terrain. Alfred Beilhartz was a child, which removes experience as a relevant variable. Crystal Riesinger had been living in Crestone long enough to be familiar with the environment. Trevor Boss was a young man whose case does not, in the public record, suggest inexperience as a contributing factor. None of these cases has the profile of a first-time visitor making a predictable mistake in unfamiliar terrain. None of them is the cautionary tale about the tourist who didn't respect the mountain. They are, each of them, Cases where the person in question had reasons to be where they were, knowledge of the environment they were in, and the kind of baseline competence that should have produced a recoverable outcome if the problem they encountered was a standard one. This is the detail that investigators carry. Not the spectacular incompetence, not the easily preventable error, but the unexplained failure in a competent person. The gap that appears where the competence and the preparation and the familiarity with the terrain should have been sufficient, and wasn't. The fourth element of the pattern is the one that connects every case most directly: the institutional response. We have spent considerable time in this episode analyzing the specific failures and limitations in the investigations and searches that followed each disappearance. The multi-day gap before the official report in Crestone, the 24-hour delay before the report in Vail, the resource constraints of rural Colorado counties, the three-dimensional search problem posed by mine shafts and cliff systems, the degradation of evidence along a heavily trafficked interstate corridor. Taken individually, each of these is a specific circumstance with a specific explanation. Taken together, they represent a systemic pattern in the way that Colorado's institutional infrastructure handles missing persons cases in the specific environments where these disappearances occurred. The pattern is not one of malice or indifference. The investigators and search teams and county sheriffs who worked these cases were, by all public accounts, doing their best with the resources they had. The pattern is one of structural limitation. The terrain is too complex. The jurisdictions are too fragmented. The resources are too thin relative to the scope of the landscape. The reporting delays are too consequential in environments where the first hours matter most. And that structural limitation means that some disappearances in Colorado, not most, not even a significant fraction of the total, but a specific subset, will produce the outcome that the cases in this episode have produced. The open file, the suspended search, the family still waiting, the impossible gap that the accounting cannot close. Here is what we know, stated as plainly as the evidence allows. Crystal Ann Reisinger was 25 years old, and she was in Crestone, Colorado, in August 2016, and she has not been seen since. Her case is open. Claudia Kirchhoff was 24 years old, and she was on Bridge Street in Vail, Colorado, in March 2001, and she has not been seen since. Her case is open. Monte Bolesky was an experienced hiker, and he entered Rocky Mountain National Park via the Longs Peak Trailhead in September 1999, and he did not exit. His case is open. Kara Nichols was 19 years old, and she left her home in Colorado Springs in October 2012. And her phone went dark south of the city on I-25, and her vehicle was found in Pueblo without her. Her case is open. Stephanie Donahue was a young woman in Steamboat Springs in 2007, and she was last seen at a local establishment, and she has not been seen since. Her case is open. Trevor Boss was a young man in Colorado Springs in 2013, and he entered the Pikes Peak foothills and did not return on the expected timeline. His case produced a partial resolution that answered the question of location, but not the questions that mattered most. Austin Rollins was a young man familiar with Colorado terrain, and his truck was found in the high country above Ouray in 2014, and he was not in it, and he has not been found. His case is open. Alfred Beilhartz was 8 years old, and he was in a campground in Rocky Mountain National Park in July 1938. And he was standing near his family, and then he was not, and the search that followed did not find him. His case is open. 8 people, 8 cases, 8 open files. Across 80 years of Colorado history, in terrain ranging from a ski resort to a high-altitude mining road, to a national park campground, to a highway corridor running south through the Front Range. The accounting does not close. We started this episode with a map. Not a metaphor, an actual map. The kind of map that Colorado produces in abundance, that you can buy in any gas station between Denver and Durango, that hikers fold into their jacket pockets and tourists spread across rental car hoods, and park rangers carry in laminated form on clipboards at trailhead kiosks. A map that shows the highways and the peaks and the trail systems and the towns. All of it rendered in the clean cartographic language that makes a landscape look comprehensible, navigable, safe. A map that sells the dream by making the terrain look like something you can hold in your hands and understand completely. We said at the beginning of this episode to pull up that map, to trace the routes with us, to follow each case from its last confirmed location into the void that followed. We have done that now. All 8 routes, all 8 voids. And here is what the map looks like when you add the 8 pins. Crestone sits in the lower left quadrant of the state, at the base of the Sangre de Cristos, where the San Luis Valley meets the mountains. Put a pin there, in the high desert scrubland, at 7,900 feet, on the dirt road where Cristal Reisinger was last seen walking in August 2016. The pin is small. The valley around it is enormous. The mountains behind it rise to over 14,000 feet and offer no comment on what happened in their shadow. Move northeast, up through the San Luis Valley, through the Arkansas River corridor, through the Central Rockies. Put a pin in Ouray County, in the high country terrain above the Box Canyon town, where the old mining roads meet the San Juan wilderness, and Austin Rollins' truck was found with the keys in the ignition in 2014. The pin sits at 10,000 feet, surrounded by the geological complexity of a landscape that has been mined and blasted and tunneled for a century, and that keeps its voids in the dark below the surface. Move north, through the San Juan Plateau, through the Gunnison country, up into the northwestern corner of the state. Put a pin in Steamboat Springs, in the Yampa Valley, on the quiet main street of a resort town in the off-season where Stephanie Donahue was last seen at a local establishment in 2007. The pin sits in a valley that looks contained and knowable from above, and that has, in its small-town familiarity, somehow held the answer to what happened to her for nearly 2 decades. Move east and then south, down the Front Range, through the mountain resort corridor. Put a pin in Vail, in the narrow valley where Gore Creek runs through the resort village and where Claudia Kirchhoff walked away from Bridge Street at 2 a.m. in March 2001. The pin sits in a geography that should have made disappearance impossible, contained, populated, well lit, and that managed it anyway. Continue south along the Front Range. Put 2 pins in Colorado Springs, close together but distinct. One for Kara Nichols, 19 years old, whose phone last pinged a cell tower south of the city in October 2012 before going dark somewhere on the I-25 corridor. One for Trevor Boss, whose case ended in the Pikes Peak foothills in 2013. In the terrain where the city's western edge meets the mountain's lower slopes and the trail system begins its climb away from the grid. Move back north, into Rocky Mountain National Park, which occupies the northern central portion of the state and rises above everything around it in the way that a place that receives 5 million visitors a year and still produces unresolved disappearances has a right to rise above the landscape. Put a pin at the Longs Peak Trailhead, where Monte Baleski's name is written in the register with an entry time and no exit time. September 1999. Put another pin somewhere in the park's interior, in the campground area near the creek where Alfred Boilhartz was standing next to his family in July 1938, and then, in the time it takes to look away and look back, was not. Return to the lower left, back to the San Luis Valley, Back to Crestone, where we started, where the first pin is already planted, where the valley holds its questions in the dark between the mountains and the stars. 8 pins, scattered across the map of Colorado in no geographic pattern that resolves into meaning. Not clustered in one region, not concentrated in one type of terrain, not aligned along a single corridor or gathered around a single geographic feature. Distributed across the state the way open questions are distributed across a case file. Everywhere and nowhere, covering the ground without revealing the answer. Pull back from the individual pins now. Pull back until the whole state is visible, until the Rockies are a spine running north to south through the middle of the frame, and the plains extend east and the plateau country extends west, and the whole of Colorado fits on the screen the way it fits on that gas station map. This is the state that sold you the dream. The 14ers and the ski resorts and the 300 days of sunshine and the trail systems that climb into country so beautiful it barely seems real. The state that 4.5 million people call home and that tens of millions more visit every year. Driving the mountain highways and hiking the national park trails and staying in the resort towns and passing through the front range cities without incident, without mystery, without anything that the brochure doesn't prepare them for. That state is real. The dream is real. And at 8 specific points on the map of that dream, in the years between 1938 and 2016, something happened that the dream cannot account for. 8 people entered the landscape, on trails, on highways, in resort towns, in campgrounds, in a small spiritual community at the base of a mountain range, and did not return in the way that anyone expected. The investigations that followed were real. The searches were real. The resources and the expertise and the years of open case file maintenance are all real. The families waiting for answers are real. The answers are not here. There is a question that every episode like this one eventually arrives at, and it is the most honest question that the format allows. Not what happened, because we have established, carefully and in detail, that what happened is in most of these cases officially unknown. Not who is responsible, because in the cases where human involvement is theorized, no charges have been filed, no convictions have been obtained, and the evidence does not support confident attribution. Not where they are, because the searches have not found them, and the terrain has not released them. The question is, what do we do with cases like these? Not in the investigative sense. That answer is the same as it always is. The continued maintenance of open files and the reception of new tips and the periodic cold case reviews that sometimes, in rare and fortunate instances, produce the new evidence that reopens an investigation. That work continues. It is being done at varying levels of resources and attention by the agencies responsible for each of these cases. The question is in the human sense. What do we do as people who have just spent time with these 8 cases, with the specific weight of knowing that 8 people went into this landscape and did not come back, and that the landscape has not explained itself? The honest answer is, we carry it. The way the families carry it. The way the investigators who worked these cases carry it. The way the search and rescue volunteers who covered the terrain and came back without the person carry it. Not as resolution, because there is no resolution to carry, but as the specific weight of an open question that the evidence does not yet answer. That weight is not comfortable. It is not supposed to be comfortable. The cases in this episode are not comfortable. They are 8 real people with real families and real open files, and the discomfort of sitting with that fact without a resolution is the most honest response available. There is a trailhead sign in Rocky Mountain National Park. You have passed it, or something like it, if you have ever hiked in that park. the standard green and brown sign that marks the beginning of a trail. With the trail name and the distance to the next landmark and the elevation gain and the standard warnings about weather and wildlife, and leaving no trace. These signs are everywhere in the park. They are part of the visual grammar of RMNP, as familiar as the peaks themselves. The sign at the Longs Peak trailhead has a registration box next to it. A metal box with a slot at the top for the paper registration cards that backcountry users fill out before they enter the trail. Name, date, intended route, expected return time, emergency contact. In September 1999, a man named Monty Bileski filled out one of those cards, put it in the slot, and walked up the trail. His card is in the record. His name is in the record. His intended route is in the record. His expected return time is in the record. He did not return at the expected time. He did not return at all. The registration box is still there. The trail is still there. The mountain is still there, exactly as it was in September 1999, in July 1938, in every year between those dates and after them. It does not change because people go into it and do not come out. It does not mark the places where the accounting stops closing. It simply stands. At 14,259 feet, above the trail register, above the open case files, above the families still waiting, and the investigators still carrying the weight of unresolved cases, and the 8 pins on the map of Colorado that have not moved in years and decades. The Rockies are still there. The trails are still open. The resort towns are still lit at night, and the highway corridors are still running with traffic, and the national park campgrounds are still full in July. And the small spiritual community at the base of the Sangre de Cristos is still there in its valley in the dark, and in 8 cases across 80 years of Colorado history. We still don't know what happened. Cristal Ann Reisinger, August 2016. Crestone, open. Claudia Kirchhoff, March 2001. Vale, open. Monty Bileski, September 1999. Rocky Mountain National Park, open. Kara Nichols, October 2012. Colorado Springs, open. Stephanie Donahue, 2007. Steamboat Springs, open. Trevor Boss, 2013. Colorado Springs, partially resolved. Questions remaining. Austin Rollins, 2014. Ouray County, open. Alfred Beilhartz, July 1938. Rocky Mountain National Park, open. 8 names, 8 dates, 8 locations on a map that does not explain itself. The map is still there if you want to look at it. The routes are still traceable. The last confirmed locations are documented, and the impossible gaps are documented, and the open files are maintained by agencies that are still, officially, looking. Pull up the map of Colorado. Look at where the trail goes cold.